Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for coming to our event. I'm so happy to see you all here. I'm Dr. Gail Presby. I'm the director of CLASA. That's the Carney Latin American Solidarity Archive. And I'm here today with our co-sponsors from Women's and Gender Studies and the Philosophy Department for a special talk on feminist approaches to argument. The Carney Archive is devoted to peace and justice issues in Latin America, but on occasion we broaden our interests to cover peace and justice topics in general. We are happy to therefore sponsor this talk related to justice because it's on feminist approaches to argument. We encourage you to look at our website and join us for other talks. I'd like to ask my two co-sponsors to help me in greeting other people. Genevieve, can you greet people, please?
Hello, everyone. On behalf of the Women and Gender Studies program, we welcome you to that talk, and we're excited to have you with us today. CLASA is putting on a series of different talks and bringing in different speakers. They all cover related but still quite diverse topics. We hope you can join us soon again for more of these wonderful discussions that we are having. Thank you, Gail, for organizing this, and thank you, Catherine, for agreeing to come and speak to us. Thanks everyone for attending.
Thank you, Genevieve. And Dr. Marty Lever, can you greet our audience and tell them how great or important it is to study philosophy?
Well, thank you, Dr. Presby. First of all, I'd like to thank Dr. Hundleby for her generosity with her time and expertise for what will prove to be a very interesting talk, I'm sure. And thank you for all our attendees. You know, we just, you know, as we look around the world today, we see so many problems, and that one thing has become clear, I think, to all of us, that I think we really all need to do a better job of philosophical thinking, identifying shared values, objective norms, and shared interests. You know, developing the skills of being able to listen to people with empathy and consideration. These are skills that are the stock and trade of philosophy, and we think that you know, the more we can pass those dispositions along, the better off we'll be. And talks like this very one on feminist approaches to argument is an important step in that direction. So welcome to everyone.
Thank you, Dr. Lever. Now, I would like to introduce you to Dr. Catherine Handlebee. She's an associate professor of philosophy, and she's cross-appointed to Women's and Gender Studies. She coordinated and launched University of Windsor's interdisciplinary Ph.D. in Argumentation Studies. Her research concerns feminist and liberatory approaches to argument theory and epistemology. On a more personal note, I want to say I first met Dr. Hundleby when the University of Windsor hosted CSWIP, the Canadian Society for Women in Philosophy, and Dr. Hundleby was central to organizing and hosting that conference. I've tried to keep those connections over the river so close and yet so far away, especially at this time of coronavirus when our visiting each other is reduced. And Dr. Handlebee is here, but before we turn to her, let's play the recording of her talk, and then she'll join us for the live Q&A.
Hello, my name is Catherine Handlebee. I'm visiting you from the University of Windsor, and I've been asked to talk to you about my research. My research is on feminist approaches to argument, and I'm going to provide for you something of an overview of the work that's been going on in the last couple of decades, but with some of my own takes on the implications of this research. The first thing I want to do before diving into the details is to make clear what I mean by an argument. I do not mean a verbal fight. While that is commonly what's understood by the word argue, or to argue, and even argumentation sometimes, verbal fights are not what the words associated with argument in other languages mean. They more typically mean the expressing of reasons. That typically means support for logical conclusions. Reasons provide logical support for conclusions. Philosophers tend to demonstrate this or represent this as a premise supporting a conclusion, a premise-conclusion complex. But when we think of an argument as an activity, as a thing we do, it's the expression of reasons. In interpreting it, we may look to make the premise and conclusion complex explicit, but as an activity, it is quite simply the expression of reasons. Today I suggest that we think about feminist approaches to argument as a form of non-ideal theory. Non-ideal theory has been articulated and developed as an approach to philosophy by American philosopher Charles Mills. Mills looks at the way that philosophy focuses on ideals, norms like justice, truth, knowledge, reason, rationality, and so on. And he says that the exclusive focus on these ideals often backfires. Insofar as these ideals are supposed to guide our behavior, if we don't attend to the various ways in which our actual situations do not measure up to those ideals, then we may actually fail to address problems. And if we fail to address problems in applying our ideals, that can make it seem as if the way things are is perfectly fine. And so problems, including social injustices, can come to seem perfectly just. For argumentation, or argument and arguing, there seem to be two non-ideal aspects that come to mind from a feminist perspective. The first is the idealization of aggression and how aggression has been associated with masculinity. The second is how standards for assessing feminist arguments may have been unjust, unfair. And that's because feminist arguments require us looking at non-ideal circumstances. One of the non-ideal aspects of argument in our society is its association with aggression, and in turn the association of aggression with masculinity. This favors what's known as heuristic argument. That is to say that it favors and works best in styles of argument where people are aiming to win. They're aiming to beat each other. And this may be by showing that they have the best reasons, or it could involve other things. The thing about heuristic argument is it's just about winning, and the quality of the reasoning may actually be incidental. Aggression and heuristic argument can also discourage women's participation. This isn't because women can't be aggressive. It's not because women don't like and enjoy sometimes aggressive interactions. Many women do. But norms of femininity discourage women from behaving aggressively, at least many norms of femininity. These can vary. There are various different subcultures, but certainly many norms of femininity discourage women exhibiting aggression and discourage women from trying to be winners, to trying to take positions of power. The association with aggression also undermines the collaborative and cooperative purposes for arguing. This is something pointed out by Oakland University philosopher Phyllis Rooney. Rooney is particularly concerned to stress that argument often serves epistemic goals that are actually quite cooperative. We both, or all, however many of us are arguing, benefit when the goal of argument is epistemic, when we develop truth and understanding. The discipline of philosophy may be hurt too, insofar as this type of aggressive reasoning seems to be characteristic of philosophical reasoning in particular. And there is work on that going back to the early 80s at the very least. So feminist approaches in this way ask us to consider other purposes that argument can serve. It can serve truth in the context of discourses and discussions that we refer to as inquiries. Argument can also serve to help us develop plans of action. This we call deliberation. Argument can help us figure out material exchanges that will be mutually beneficial. This we call negotiation. And of course, we can also use argument to injure each other. That's the form of argument known as the quarrel. These different discussion types, discourse types, are identified by a Windsor philosopher recently passed, Douglas Walton. For the problem of aggression, it may seem that politeness is an obvious answer. Unfortunately, politeness also reflects gendered and racialized norms, ways of behaving that will not appear aggressive or impolite coming from a white man will appear to be impolite or too aggressive coming from a woman or a person of color. And so politeness is not, does not provide a solution at all. However, looking at the role of politeness raises some really interesting questions about what else is going on when we argue. Some of the other functions that arguments serve in addition to those recognized by Walton. We can even begin to think that politeness provides a goal for argument. The politeness studies literature regularly recognizes that politeness serves face goals. You'll be familiar with phrases of saving face and losing face. This is about maintaining, sustaining, and risking our goals, our roles within a community. Face goals are about maintaining face, having a particular kind of identity within a community. The place of this in the context of argument has been addressed by Michael Gilbert. Adding to this, some more recent work by Tempest Henning, we can recognize that face goals are differently maintained in different ethnic contexts. And while the standards of politeness that may be assumed by white people or people of European descent like myself, Anglo too on top of that. So politeness of a sort of cold, crisp, unemotional, non-confrontational sort has been standard. For people like me, politeness seems an answer to aggression. But for other people, a certain kind of aggression, a certain kind of aggressive argument can actually be part of what's needed to maintain face, part of what's needed to participate fully in a community. In certain cultures, if you don't argue, you're viewed as standoffish, as cold, as not participating. This includes Jewish cultures and African American cultures, and I'm sure you can think of some others too, if you take a minute. This suggests to me that the face goals and politeness as part of pursuing face goals could sometimes interfere with other goals. Certainly, certain forms of politeness might interfere with certain forms of heuristic argument. And we might think that's good, because heuristic argument and quarrels are perhaps not the type of argument we want to encourage. But what about politeness when it comes to something like inquiry, getting to the truth? Can we be too polite then? Is our desire to seem like nice people and serve that sort of face goal the wrong sort of goal to have? These are some of the questions that feminists ask about argument. A second aspect of feminist theory of argument that relates to non-ideal aspects of arguing has to do with liberatory arguments. That is, feminist and other arguments that are aiming to recognize the needs for social change and social justice to achieve goals of a more liberated society. The difficulty is that the standards of argument recognized by philosophers and logicians and argumentation theorists and accepted more generally in our culture may not represent well the forms of analysis that challenge the status quo, because the forms of analysis used by philosophers and others are designed to serve the status quo, the culture as it currently exists. One example of this can be found in the research by Margaret Crouch at Eastern Michigan University. Crouch has a couple of papers on the genetic fallacy and feminist critique, and she looks at how the way certain philosophers employed their theoretical understanding of the genetic fallacy was unfair to the feminist critique. Now, the genetic fallacy says that it is often wrong to look at how an opinion or idea or theory is generated, its genesis. So if we look at whether something comes from a religious text, or if, and that therefore maybe we would say it was good, or maybe we would say it was bad, or if we look at something coming from Nazis, say, and therefore say it's bad, we're not providing a very good argument unless we show a connection between those good or bad sources and what we think makes that opinion good. So when we criticize vegetarianism by saying Hitler was a vegetarian, we are providing a bad genetic argument, because there is no reason to think that the bad things about Hitler are connected with his vegetarianism. Now, feminists, feminist theorists, feminist philosophers have criticized philosophy and the way that philosophy defers to theories developed by people who were very sexist and the product of a patriarchal society. Now, we are all products of a patriarchal society. We don't want to dismiss all of our views, but we do want to look sometimes with a very skeptical eye at some of the history of philosophy and how gender may be operating in an oppressive fashion in those canonical theories. And feminists have done so. They've done so in many, many different ways. In turn, some philosophers have tried to dismiss feminist views of philosophy and their criticisms of the discipline by saying that feminists commit the genetic fallacy. But feminists' criticism of philosophy and the history of philosophy are not simply based on people being sexist or the culture being patriarchal. The feminist analysis always provides some reason to see how those sexist views or patriarchal assumptions affect what is said. And so the genetic fallacy, the label of genetic fallacy, has been sort of weaponized against these marginalized positions who needed a more sensitive treatment, who needed to be treated with greater care and recognition that they were providing a type of reasoning that actually constitutes an exception to the genetic fallacy. And if we look at argumentation scholarship, we see that all fallacies admit of substantial exceptions. Another problem that arises with giving liberatory arguments a fair shake is that sometimes the arguments provided challenge assumptions about what count as good reasons. Sometimes the arguments for, say, the problem of sexual harassment require us to attend to the evidence of personal experience, something which is often discounted in a culture where we assume that everybody is equal, in a culture that assumes that everything is okay, in a culture that assumes the status quo is all we need. So these are some of the problems with standards of argumentation in our culture as viewed from a feminist perspective. These problems raise further issues for the role of argument in our general culture. We teach children and post-secondary students how to argue. This is a classic part of education, part of critical thinking education. And if we are teaching standards that encourage social injustices, then we are entrenching social injustices in the most basic level of our interactions, in our discussion, in our exchange of reason. And this is important in turn for the operation of democracy, because arguing is fundamental to democracy, and education is fundamental to democracy. Exchanging reasons and learning and having an educated and informed populace, to the extent possible, benefits democracy. And this requires the best standards of education that don't replicate forms of social injustice. It requires us thinking about argument and beginning to develop forms of education in argument that address some of these non-ideal components to the ways that we exchange reasons. to find out more about feminist approaches to argumentation theory, you could see my recently published overview in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, and here are the sources that I cited. Thanks for your attention. I look forward to chatting with you.
Kate, thank you so much for that. Very clear and also challenging us to think of some difficult issues.
Thanks. I appreciated the opportunity to, having just written this piece for the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, to step back from it and think about, what is this project, right? How does it, what is it that makes it fit together? How might one theorize what makes this a coherent approach to argument and arguing? And so this is my very first attempt to do so. And I look forward to being able to talk about it and work through some of the weaker parts and see if I can strengthen them and develop them. You mentioned to me, Dr. Presby, that you had a colleague who had written a book on civility, and that sounds so exciting. So I went, managed to get that pretty quickly, and I'm excited to read that because I've been thinking some more about civility. There's a whole bunch of really interesting discussion going on about civility now, and I think we really need to have it, given how many people feel despair at the state of public discourse.
Okay, I think during Q&A, we may visit this issue. And so, speaking of Q&A, this is the time for your participation. And what I'd like to do is suggest to you that there are two different ways as attendees that you can participate. One way is to raise your hand. And if you raise your hand, I can call on you, I can unmute you and call on you to ask your question. And otherwise, you can put your question in the chat. And if you put your question in the chat, I will presume that you want me to read your question. So we are recording this. We're looking forward to hearing from you all. I'm just going to mention your first names when I repeat one of your questions, for example. But I want to give folks a chance to write something. And while people are thinking of their questions, because I don't see any raised hands yet, and I know it often takes a moment before people are ready. Let me just ask you a question, because you talked about this genetic fallacy. And being here at a Catholic university, we often have celibate male clergy talking a lot about issues of marriage and reproduction. And they would consider themselves specialists because of their in-depth theological training. Now, what do you think about, is this a case of genetic fallacy or not? Because I can see it being a thorny issue. Can no one ever be an expert in an area they have no personal experience? Just wondering what you might think.
So the area of expertise is what is it again? It's
So,
reproduction?
for example, you may have a Catholic clergy that's mostly male and celibate, deciding the morality of issues of marriage and contraception. Sorry to start with such a, maybe it's a hard one.
Oh, wow. It's the genetic fallacy. Well, the genetic fallacy, it sometimes is going to be wrong, right? Just because not all genetic appeals are fallacious doesn't mean that some aren't actually fallacious, right? So it is often, there are many types of fallacies, including certain sorts of ad hominems, which many people will be familiar with. When you appeal to somebody's personal characteristics and dismiss what they say as a result, it's often inappropriate. There are certain contexts where it is appropriate. One of the classic examples of when it seems reasonable is when we're talking about politicians, right? Because for politicians, reputation and reliability is a big part of what we're looking for from them. And so their personal characteristics and their track record are often closely involved with the things they are saying that we want to measure the truth of. So the question is then, for celibate priests, is the experience of marriage and heterosexuality, active heterosexuality, is that relevant to one's ability to make decisions about the ethics of marriage and reproduction? And I tend to think yes. I tend to think yes, that does seem like it would be the sort of thing one might say is a genetic fallacy. But you have to, one of the things about fallacies is there are a lot of questions that have to be answered in order to make the case. So we would have to say, we would have to have certain understandings of how the experience of these things relates to the ethics of it. And that would be complicated. And that's going to, it's going to, one of the things about people who are not priests is that they aren't supported by institutions in the same way that priests are, for instance. So while a priest might think, well, you should have a child, not recognizing the major hardship that this might create for some people who are dealing with an unwanted pregnancy, or financial hardship, psychological hardship. These are all relevant things. And also relevant is that priests have certain sorts of goals in their lives that may be quite different from the goals of people who choose not to be priests. And for priests to make decisions about the ethics of these matters is pretty questionable, I would say, without having direct experience of some of these things like the material vulnerability of a family, the psychological strain of raising children, and the types of life goals that people have who aren't priests. I think these are all relevant considerations that would suggest that priests are not in a good situation, even though they may have studied ethical texts, which gives them a certain kind of authority, and they may have read from people who have had these sorts of experiences. Their ability to evaluate those sources may be compromised by their lack of personal experience. Yeah, I think it could be. And thank you for challenging me in that way. That I would have never imagined answering that question. But
I should have tipped you off.
yeah, thanks.
I thought of it as an icebreaker, but maybe It was a little.
It's heavy in a lot of ways, but it gets into some things that I'm really interested in, like how choices people make about how they want to live their lives, and how hard it is to understand someone who makes different kinds of life choices than you do. Yeah.
Right. And more recently, we have women religious in the Catholic Church like Margaret Farley talking in depth about sexual ethics. So at least we have a women's perspective on the issue. So it's good to hear some of those new perspectives.
For sure.
I now want to call on Tariq, who is going to ask us a question. So please, Tariq.
Hi, Mrs. Hundleby. How are you?
I'm well, Tariq.
Is it Dr. Hundleby or should I say Mrs. Hundleby?
It's doctor. It's doctor. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So I guess I liked your talk. I liked your presentation a lot, by the way.
Thank you.
I feel like a lot of the time, even though like I'm a man, I'm a very like confrontational guy. I don't like problems, and I don't like getting into arguments. If I want to argue someone, I want it to be like, you know, peaceful and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of the time, I feel like I run into like, I have a lot of religious friends, right? And I guess what I'm trying to ask is, religious people, I'm not saying all religious people, but a lot of religious people like to get nitpicky with the details of the religion, say you can't do this, you can't do
Mm-hmm.
that. And if you do this, you know, you're getting sins. If you're doing that, you're getting sins. I don't know. So I guess what I'm trying to ask is, without being, you know, aggressive or anything, how do I approach that? Am I supposed to not say anything? Am I supposed to, how would you approach, if I told you, like, for example, like, abortion is completely wrong, you're going to hell if you ever abort a baby, something like that. Am I supposed to like stay quiet, or what's my response? I know what I would say.
This is a really, really hard question. There's a lovely piece by American philosopher Barrett Emmerich that deals with how do we address these sorts of deep disagreements with people we care about, friends or family, and these sorts of things. And Emmerich suggests that this was something he was inspired to write because of his teaching. He found at the end of teaching classes on social justice issues, students would say, how do I go back and talk to my family? Right? You know, how do I deal with their racism and their sexism? And how do I convince them that, you know, that this is wrong or that's wrong? And this is often not something you can deal with immediately. I think one of the things we have to recognize about arguing is that it goes on actually over a long period of time, especially when we have relationships with people. And we can take advantage of that. We can build trust, and we can start to change people's minds one premise at a time. We can spend some time discussing things and figuring out what seems to be the basis of our disagreement and exploring that, but not expect to ever change someone's, well, not ever, sometimes you can change someone's mind in one sit down or one exchange, but often it takes a lot longer than that, which is hard because often when you hear people saying things that you think are terribly wrong, you want to correct them, right? We all want to have that witty comeback that just shows the person exactly how they're wrong. But that is very, very rare, and it's often not received well by the person who is on the other end of it. Finding ways to, and this is part of Michael Gilbert's view of the fellow who talks about face goals. Part of Michael Gilbert's view about argumentation too is that we should have a coalescent view. We should view our success in argument not in terms of whether we persuade another person, but whether we find common understandings and whether we're able to find more ways to relate to each other in constructive ways. That was a long answer, but
No, it was a good answer. Thank you very much.
you're welcome.
Thanks. At this point, I'm going to try to combine some questions from Anika and Regina in the chat, and then we'll go to Emma next. So Anika is, in relation to this issue of aggression, she goes, how can I address misconceptions about my religion or race without hurting people or making them feel like I am aggressive? And she seems concerned that people think that women are always in households, so they should only work in households or household-like jobs. And she's wondering, can she call that a fallacy? Well, let's leave it at that.
Okay. Well, actually, I wrote a paper on something related to that, which I called the status quo fallacy. And it's in a book on implicit bias and philosophy. I think it is a type of fallacy. It is a type of fallacy. The point I make there is that it's fallacious reasoning when we assume an androcentric norm, or a white norm for that matter. If we assume that the standard person, the most valuable person, is a white man or other forms of social privilege, and we base our reasoning on that, it's fallacious, because it's just based on stereotypes. It's just based on our experience of social hierarchies, which may be just or unjust. So yeah, I'd say it is a fallacy, absolutely. Even if it has been true in our culture for a while, that men have done certain sorts of things and women have done other sorts of things, we can't say that that should be the case. You could also call this the naturalistic fallacy, because you're arguing on the basis of what has been the case to what should be the case. You're deriving an ought from an is. And that's been recognized as a fallacy by philosophers for a long time.
Okay, thanks so much. Regina has a question about people who use the terms feminist peace or feminist foreign policy. What do you think about the use of terms like that?
Yeah, I saw that question in the chat and I was trying to wrap my head around it, because I'm not familiar with this. Perhaps because I tend to focus on the feminism and science literature more than the feminist politics material. So feminist peace, and what was the other thing?
Feminist foreign policy.
Feminist foreign policy. I don't know what feminist peace means exactly. I mean, I know that there have been certain feminist philosophers, especially Sarah Ruddock, who argued that women's ways of thinking, or the practice that women have of maintaining families, and that tradition, that aspect of women's culture, helps support a certain peaceful outlook. And I have some sympathy for that, except that women's experience isn't actually all that uniform in that way. So if it means something like that, I think there are problems. As for feminist foreign policy, I think that can make a lot of sense. Absolutely. I also think feminist physics can make a lot of sense, as well as other kinds of feminist science. So in the context of political science and policy, for sure. Now, I don't have a lot of expertise in policy per se, but what is that going to mean? It's going to mean things like attending to women's needs, and the ways in which other people are socially marginalized. So one thing is that a lot of women in the world spend a great deal of time obtaining water. Obtaining water for themselves and for their families, for their communities. So feminist foreign policy can prioritize things like the accessibility of water, and thus take a big burden off of women. We also know that there's been some great evidence that educating girls is one of the best ways to lift a community, a culture out of poverty. Right, so that would be feminist foreign policy, to support the international education of girls, make sure they get decent educations. So these are all things. Are they distinctively feminist? Are they just good foreign policy? Well, that's a tough question. Why call it feminist? I've been starting to think about this question a little bit. I've thought about it in the past, but so what makes that feminist? Well, I often follow feminist standpoint theory. And so I say it's feminist because the answer that's developed is gained by asking questions about women's needs and the problems women face. What makes it feminist is not the solution. You know, water, there's nothing necessarily feminist about water. But if we get to that solution by asking questions about women's needs, then it's a feminist solution.
Okay, thanks so much. Now we have two folks with their hands raised. So I'm first going to call on Emma.
Hi there, can you hear me?
I can.
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your great presentation and knowledge. I just had a question about, I guess more of an opinion on your end. In terms of aggression being linked to masculinity and that heuristic approach to arguments, do you think if women got over, say you're in a male predominant profession, and if a woman is to present with more of an aggressive approach or that just about winning approach to her arguments and way about performing her work, do you think that she would be looked at differently in a positive way? Or do you think if a woman is to portray more of an aggressive winning approach in that profession, she's looked at as almost kind of crazy? Because I don't know, I just think in like, especially healthcare, if you're a woman and you have that same aggression, say as like a CRNA and your counterparts who are men, if you come in with an aggressive winning approach and just really want to excel at your work, are you looked at in a different way? Or do you think it makes you look better to your counterparts?
That is a really hard question. That is a really hard question. I also have a friend who wrote an article on that. Like, you folks ask great questions. You're really recognizing some of the deep issues here and the complexities. There's no easy solution, as I think you recognize. When women in male-dominated fields tend to find themselves in what Michigan philosopher Marilyn Frye calls a double bind, that whatever they do, they're going to be subject to extra criticism. If they opt out of the heuristic game and they try to find more collaborative roles for themselves, they're going to be seen as not serious. If they opt in and assert themselves as players in the game, they're going to be viewed as, what did you say? Hostile, crazy. Yeah, crazy happens a lot. Yeah, it's crazy. Hostile, mean, yeah. And I think there's a good deal of evidence about this. Even, you know, the stuff about women speaking up at meetings and how they tend to be criticized, even if they don't taking up too much time, when they don't take up their own sort of share of the time. Yeah, so there's no easy solution. At the personal level, it's very hard to deal with these structural inequities because you get punished whatever you do, or you get marginalized, whatever you do, to put it in somewhat more moderate terms.
Okay, I don't see another hand just now, so I want to turn to the chat. I have a question from Nicholas Blakey. He says, there are people who are leaders on several different platforms and several different apps. Social media is very real in this age, and celebrities and others who share feminist fallacious views have a lot of followers. Here is my question. Is there anything that can be done so that the balance of genders stays true? Should we do something even?
Okay, there are a couple things there I'm not sure I understand. One
right.
is...
Let me, hold on, because I asked Nicholas a question and clarification about what he meant, and he said, I'm saying that there are some leaders on social media who share some fallacious views.
Okay, so it would help me to know who exactly this might be. I mean, if I think of Gwyneth Paltrow and Goop, like there's a lot of nonsense there, much of which could be described as fallacious. And that would still, you know, want to call itself feminist. There are certainly a lot of stuff out there that claims to be, you know, about woman power in some way that I think is very poor reasoning, including certain assumptions about women being necessarily any one way or the other. Because women vary a lot, just like men vary a lot. So maybe, Nicholas, if I don't know what kind of fallacy you have in mind here, because there's so many.
Nicholas, you could either raise your hand and follow up or chat a little bit more to us so we know what you're meaning.
It's interesting that, you know, women really are quite, I don't know, dominant on social media, but they certainly have a big presence.
In the meantime, why don't we go to the next question and we'll see if we hear again from Nicholas.
Okay.
So Tiziana wants to know, do you have any suggestions on how to empower our daughters or how to prepare them to face these challenges?
How to prepare them to face these challenges, how to empower them. Well, I don't have any children myself. So I to get back to the question of the priests and being able to say these things, I know I often speak of a place of ignorance in this regard, but I do think, you know, attention to the next generation, that's where the change happens, generation to generation. Unfortunately, well, maybe it's good because humans can only handle so much change. So change happens slowly and injustices are remedied slowly. And often it happens through the change of generations. You know, I'm encouraged by a lot of things like the way my students have such an open-minded view of gender and trans people and gender fluid people and all these sorts of things. So I think there's some potential for some pretty significant cultural change that's in the pipeline already. How to empower our daughters generally is something I don't even know where to begin with. However, how to empower our daughters with reasoning? I think education is a big part of it. When you know what you're talking about, right, it's harder for people to push you around in conversation. So, and I think that's one of the reasons so many girls and women pursue post-secondary education, right? More than boys and men do, because it is empowering at a very immediate level in allowing you to express yourself and demand credit for your understanding and your knowledge. The more education you have, the better able you are to do that. So I despair that with the rise of student debt, that so much of that goes on the backs of women. But I also think that there are very good reasons that women and girls pursue education, because it is one of the most general paths toward empowerment for women and anybody.
Okay, thanks a lot. Do we have any other questions? I know we're coming up on 2 o'clock, and sometimes people have to leave around 2 o'clock. So I can say to any of you who have to leave, we understand. But I'm wondering if we could have one last question. Anybody? Jessica, oh, you have class, because I saw your hand was raised before. Do you have a chance? Aha, okay, so we're going to hear one last question from Jessica. Where did she go? I saw her hand raised a second ago. There it is. Yes, please go ahead.
Great presentation. And my question was just kind of in general, like I really like the video, like you talked about the different approaches and everything we can take. But like I was just thinking, like even if you do follow the approaches and like you're going by everything you can, but like the argument is like, still taking place and it has a tendency to get violent. What is like your best suggestion on what we can do from there?
If I understand you properly, one thing I think it's important to recognize is that you don't have to get into every argument.
Mm-hmm.
You don't. Arguing and exchanging reasons can be really, really valuable, but it can also be a big waste of time and just create tensions. And as you said, it can make you vulnerable.
Mm-hmm.
So sometimes it's best to just like, it may be interpreted by other people as you backed out, but other people can be quite ignorant that way. So if you don't feel that you can make reasonable progress in talking to somebody, then there's really not much reason to pursue a discussion with them.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Thanks so much for that advice. That's a good parting advice. We can choose our battles and decide to argue when we think it's appropriate. Very good. Since we are coming up on the hour, I do want to close our session, but let's close with some great thanks to Dr. Catherine Hundleby for answering our questions and for clarifying this difficult topic so much. Thank you so much. And thank you to all attendees for coming and for participating. And all I can say is, Dr. Handlebee, be sure to tell us about opportunities for us on this side of the river to be part of your philosophy programming in the future, because I know you do have some even undergraduate conferences and things like that that we may be interested in.
Okay. Absolutely. Thank you so much for a wonderful discussion. I feel like I really had my mind and my thinking exercised. It was really good.
Okay, thank you so much. And so thank you to all. I'll be ending the session, but thank you very much all for participating. Bye.